All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for the introduction, Susanna. And Walter and I are very happy to be here, and it's exciting to be on this first day of the festival. We have been in this field for many years, as you've heard. We've also worked together for a long time. We've known each other since before the start of our professional careers, and have seen our two different factions converge as Walter came from medical devices and I came from games, and now we're doing games for medical devices. So we'll be talking about some of these tensions. And let it be said that over the years, we've learned to appreciate each other's viewpoints. So we do find it hard to disagree these days, but we know that a lot of people just getting into it from the game side or from the medical and research side often have some problems. And we'll be delving into those a little bit as we go through this. And let me start it off by just suggesting that one of the things I know that a lot of game developers find frustrating in working with trying to do games for health is that there are sometimes decades old protocols that the rehabilitation clinicians or the doctors, the people on the medical side want to follow. For example, that there's a pre-test and post-test survey, and they want the games to basically recreate those precisely. So you end up having a survey form that you click off on the screen, and the game developers are told, can't we just make this a little bit more fun, but don't change anything? And Walter, maybe you can speak to some of the pressures that push the medical side in that direction.
Oh, sure, absolutely. And Noah, you're right. We do have different backgrounds, and our different fields have different languages, different cultures, different points of view. But I think we're learning to meet in the middle and help each other. And to your specific example of one of the dynamic tensions being because there is a need on the part of research and validation of clinical protocols to have certain standards that are across platform and across indication that we can do comparisons. That does often conflict with the rapid prototyping dynamic aspect of game development. And it's not just the protocols, it's also the units of measurement, it's the standards, the equipment that's used for measurement. So there does need to be an understanding. And it's also frustrating for the research scientists and clinicians too, to sometimes be pushed to use a measurement scale or an inventory or a way of measuring something as subtle as a mood or an emotion using old techniques and paper and pencil methods. But they gradually evolve. There's just a bit of a lag between what is the state of the art and the best way to capture some information and what has already been validated and what is the standard right now. But between that dynamic tension, I think there's ways to sort of cleverly bake in some of the existing approaches and sort of hide it inside the game heuristics.
Well, that's it's interesting to me to consider how the academic and medical research progress is made on these things, because of course there is progress made, and I imagine that there's some level of frustration within academia about, can't we use, well, just as a simplest example, some of this Q&A or the test sessions that people have to go through when they're on a medical procedure are very much, back in that pen and paper world, as you say, whereas sometimes the wearables we have or the phone in our pocket actually can measure and know a lot of the information you'd otherwise be asking. And how do people on the research side push those things along so that we on the game side can actually use some of the latest technologies?
Well, it's a matter of taking the time to show compatibility and correlation. As new methods for measuring things evolve, as new ways to characterize something, as new technology platforms evolve, we need to take the time to link the new method, the new approach, to what was previously used so that we can make sure that we're not going in the wrong direction, and to make sure that what we are measuring really does tell us what we think it does. And it's really, in a way, it's sort of a time delay. If somebody comes up with a new way of leveraging mobile technology, for example, to measure anxiety or depression, you just can't jump in and say, okay, this is the new way of doing things. We need to say it's the new way of doing things, and it is closely correlated with the previous ways. And as a matter of fact, perhaps more precise because we've correlated with some brain imaging secondary measure that indicates the value of this approach. But it takes time, it takes money, and a lot of hard work to show that these new methods are compatible and comparable and appropriate compared to the old methods. And of course, there's a lot of wildcatters out there that just sort of jump in and say, we're going to do it this new way. And often that creates a little bit of frustration on the part of the more, I guess, conservative, serious clinical community, research community. But, it moves forward.
Yeah, well, it's becoming apparent to me that a lot of the conflict between these sort of 2 points of view comes down to time, and that in the games industry, we're used to doing things so quickly. And one of those areas that, probably more than any that I've seen that has come up in the medical side of things is just how long and difficult a lot of the testing procedures are. We're used to doing Q&A and testing in the games industry, and often in most games companies, there's a first phase of friends and family testing where you don't even have to go out outside of your closest circle to just find some people to try things out. And granted, in a lot of the medical procedures, particularly if you're making a game that's meant to treat some sort of disorder, you need to find people who have that. So I understand that you can't simply just test it with, the programmers and artists, within the games group. But one of the things that I found that was a shock to me the first time I realized it is that it's hard to raise money for games. Everybody knows that part of things. It's just hard to raise money in general, and I appreciate the fact that the festival focuses on that a lot. But if you have raised, $1 million for a project, in the game side of things, we want to devote the lion's share of that to making a great game. And the sense is that if it really works well, that's the most important thing. And I've come to learn that not only do the testing procedures end up taking a big chunk of that, they end up taking most of that. Sometimes as much as 70 or 80% of the money you've raised goes to testing the thing that you now spend the remaining 20% making. And can you talk a little bit about why it's so important to do so much testing, or why it's so difficult to test with people, particularly on these medical procedures?
Well, it's important because we need to know that something works. If we're prescribing something to help with a serious medical condition, or even also on the zone of health and wellness, we need to know as best we can, who does it work for, how well does it work, how can we make certain claims about efficacy, and we just need to do that. So in a way, you might have a waterfall approach or a rapid prototyping approach to developing something, but there needs to be a pause to check, to make sure you're going down the right track, and to make sure that what you're designing does correlate and match the needs. And you're absolutely right. It is hard sometimes to find the right group to do the studies on and to do the hard work of doing and expensive work of doing these studies. But it's critical, because otherwise we're at risk of coming up with, especially with how fast things are evolving with digital health technology, we're at risk of developing a whole landslide of new interventions that are untethered to necessarily what works the best way. So it's critical. It's a critical part of user testing, validation, critical part of product development in this zone. But I will say, I think the research and science community, clinical community, can learn a lot from the game development community about how to do A/B testing, and how to do more citizen science research, how to leverage communities. So there is tremendous value of having a very active dialogue between the communities. And I'm also, one of the things that I think is our biggest problem right now is we bring new digital health technology out to healthcare is adherence. A lot of the things that are developed by a clinical group, by a research group, are just lame. They're just boring, and people use them a few times, and then they never go back, or they throw the device against the wall and sweep it into the dustbin. And what I think we can learn by working together is how to make things that are just wonderful to use and bring people back. And from there, then the scientists and clinical researchers can jump in and start saying, here's what we know works, but maybe this part could be a little bit better. I think the other thing to keep in mind is really for many of these products, the foundation has to be basic research, basic neuroscience, basic physiology. As part of the input to the process, it has to be built upon a foundation of understanding how the body works, how the brain works, and how behavior works. So it really is a dynamic process. And I think the communities can learn from each other. I think there's sometimes a gap in terms of nomenclature and a gap in terms of style, but basically, we're learning how to work together. And Noah, you might want to talk for a moment about one of the projects you did designing Neuroracer for the project with Adam Ghazali's research group at UCSF.
Sure. Well, I mean, that has been probably the best learning experience for me. And for people who don't know, Neuroracer was a predecessor to the company that became Achille Interactive. That was last year the first company to have, so far the only company to have a game cleared by the FDA for prescription by doctors for treatment of a disorder, in this case, ADHD. Well, I would say, I think you're right. I mean, one of the things that I found particularly interesting in working with neuroscientists is that, we on the game side of things, we've been, empirically experimenting with how to make games more compelling for decades now. And we've learned a lot of techniques. And it felt very isolated in that we're sort of out there trying to figure out what is it about interactivity or the way these games work that really engages people. And meanwhile, on the neuroscience side, people have been researching exactly those things, but often the tools that they have been very boring. And one of the problems that comes up is, if you're moving, for example, a cursor around to click on different dots on a screen, that might be fine for a minute or two. But if you then need somebody to do that for 20 minutes before you can get good data, and worse, you need to do that over and over again over the course of weeks or months, pretty soon they get so bored doing that it ruins the data, from what I've seen. So the neuroscientists really love having games that make it more engaging. The game designers and our side of things really loves to finally understand what's going on inside our brains when people are playing games, so that we can make them more effective and more enjoyable. So there is, in that sense, this wonderful, synergy. But there still is, I find, a tension in that one of the things that comes up that's a bit of a pet peeve of mine is that there is something that some friends of mine have called the magic fairy dust paradox, where the neuroscientists may say, well, can't you just add some game stuff? I know we need to do this boring survey. Just, game it up, put on one of those badges to say you've completed the survey, and then it'll be fine. And I just find that frustrating, because making a good game, obviously, if it was as easy as that, then everybody would be getting rich making great games all the time. And as it happens, it turns out to be, like any other endeavor, a really hard thing to do well. So I guess my plea to some of the researchers is to understand that the stuff that we're doing on the side of making something fun for adherence is just as subtle and complex as creating the kind of protocols you're using for treatment in the first place. So it's been one of my frustrations there.
Yeah, I think both groups need to learn from each other about the complexity and depth of our trade. I think a counter frustration on the part of the research groups and the clinical groups is that what we do is also takes great time and requires a depth of knowledge that can take decades to acquire. And yet we'll see someone who is with wonderful intentions coming from the game development arena, who might have a relative who developed a clinical condition of some sort, and they understand that the existing products, be they pharmaceutical or a medical device or a digital health device, or there's an unaddressed need. So they will put together something pretty rapidly that and make a lot of claims saying this will treat Alzheimer's, or this will prevent this problem, or use this and you won't be depressed. And it's from the point of view of scientists or clinical experts, those claims are dangerous. That they sure, it's appealing to be able to download an app that might help with some of these problems, but if it hasn't been well designed with the foundation of understanding the science and the clinical knowledge that should be built into it, and if wild claims are made, it makes our job a lot harder, because people wonder, well, why should I spend some money on this more expensive thing that might have had a decade worth of design and effort and validation built into it, when I can go to an app store and download one of the thousands of things that claim to treat the same problem. And so there is, I think, a lot to be learned by understanding each other in terms of how deep our work can go, and some of the constraints that are there. That being said, I think that these barriers are sort of gradually eroding. That conferences like this bring people together who can share information, and also I think we're coming up with new tools that sort of bridge the gap. I think with machine learning and wearable sensors and some powerful ways of intervening and evoking a behavior or a movement or an emotional response that can leverage the design and artistic and storytelling skills of the other communities. There's such potential of fantastic products being developed because of this overlap, that we are starting to work together, and we are learning that language barrier, experience barrier, culture barrier, I think is eroding as more and more people work together and cross over.
Well, you remind me of one thing, a very positive sign of that. Just a few days ago, I gave a talk at a worldwide group of pharmacy students and recent graduates. I guess it's an organization that has almost 500,000 members. And I was really excited that this year they were actually doing a games hackathon as part of their annual World Congress. And it's a good sign that I think the next generation of healthcare workers who have grown up with games and modern technology and VR are looking for ways to integrate that into their practice right from the beginning. So hopefully we'll see a lot more of that. But I know, I think you'll be telling people how we can go to our Q&A session next, so that we can actually answer some of your questions directly, those of you who want to follow up on this.
Yeah, that's right. We'd love to hear some observations and questions from our audience. So we'll see you. There's a link in the chat window to the Spark Q&A session. And Noah, I'll join you there so we can take some questions.
Sounds good. And thank you again to our audience and to our organizers. I love how, all the work that has gone into the festival here, and really appreciate all the support that we get. I hope everybody here is having a good time and sticks with us for the next few days.